introducing our topic today. So welcome to the All-Person Trails session at the Massachusetts Rhode Island Conservation Conference. So our two speakers today, first is Lucy Gertz, who is the Statewide Education Projects Manager at Mass Audubon. Lucy is, sorry, let me start over. Lucy Gertz is Mass Audubon's Statewide Education Projects Manager, supporting education at 20 nature centers. About 5 years ago, Lucy developed an interest in the social sciences, particularly how people relate to environmental issues and conservation. And she is currently midway through her doctoral studies in conservation psychology and sustainability behavior. One of her research areas is understanding how people who enjoy bird watching engage with conservation behaviors. And our other main speaker today is Ray Lyons. Ray is a conservation attorney based in Harvard, Mass. He represents land trusts including the New England Forestry Foundation and the Northeast Wilderness Trust and conservation-minded landowners. He serves on the Land Trust Alliance's Education Committee and is an active emeritus member of the Alliance's Conservation Defense Advisory Committee. His father was also a quadriplegic. Ray offers a practical perspective to working with people with disabilities. And our third speaker, who will be doing a celebrity guest appearance at the end of the session, is Scott McMorrill, who is with the Massachusetts OHV program. Okay, and without further ado, let's get this started. So let me pull up Lucy's presentation.
Okay, am I all set, Nick?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this important topic. And at Mass Audubon, as part of my work, I was asked in about 2006 to start developing all persons trails for Mass Audubon. And since then, I have coordinated the work to we now operate 12 all persons trails. And all of the other layers of work involved in making our sanctuaries more inclusive and accessible. And I'm going to give you an overview of what that work looks like, and then you can hopefully use this information and get your organizations further along wherever you are and however far you want to go with this work. So, next slide, please. There are a lot of steps to developing an all-persons trail. I'm going to outline some of the bigger steps. The first thing we do is assess some physical planning and design parameters. You know, do we have a wetland we need to cross over with a boardwalk? Do we have a cart path that can be updated for ADA compliance simply by making sure the width, the slope, the surfacing, and the elevation changes are suitable to meet ADA compliance. So we have simple trails as well as really complex, expensive trails. So that physical planning, design, thinking goes in first. And at the same time, besides the physical parameters of the trail, we want to make sure the trail goes to interesting places with scenic vistas and different habitat types and different wildlife viewing opportunities. So that's the whole physical assessment. Once we have a vision for what we want to do, then we have to raise the funds. These trails can cost as little as $5,000 if you're just making a cart path into an accessible nature trail. At other sites, we've spent as much as $100,000 because there's quite a bit of elevation changes and we have to raise low areas and put boardwalks in over wetlands. And so actually, I think we just did our first trail construction project that was over $100,000 last year. So the fundraising or the funding is a very important component. And the third thing is permitting and construction. And so because so many of our trails are in wetlands or vegetated buffer zones. There's permitting that has to happen. We want to have, minimal impact on the resource. So there's a lot of construction planning and permitting, and these 3 steps actually often take us 2 years. This is not fast work if you have a complex trail to design. If you have a simpler trail to design that's not in a wetland zone, then it's much quicker. But I just wanted to give you a preview of the kind of work and thinking that goes in before we start putting people on the trail. Next slide, please. So while you're planning, or while we are planning a trail physically, we also have to keep building our organizational capacity for accessibility and inclusion. We don't look at it simply as if you build it, people will come. We feel like there's a lot more. We've learned there's a lot more to inviting people to use accessible, inclusive experiences. So here's what we've learned. A very important part of building organizational capacity is working with our staff. If you're building a trail at an unstaffed site, you might not have to deal with this quite as much. But we're operating these trails at staffed nature centers, and so we want the staff there to know exactly what they need to know. So that includes the Americans with Disabilities Act. What does that mean? What are the regulations? What are people's rights under that law? What can you and can you not ask someone who shows up with a service animal? These are all guidelines and regulations that are mandated by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we want to make sure our staff and volunteers who are at these sites are very familiar with those laws and regulations. We also do a lot of training on what I call Accessibility 101, etiquette, language, how do you offer assistance, and to what extent, communications, all of these interactions that you have with people who are going to use the trails need to follow the latest accessibility etiquette and best practices, and that includes inclusive customer service, which supports visitors. So when somebody shows up at one of our trails and has an issue or has a problem accessing the trail or the trail materials, I want to make sure that our customer service is as inclusive as possible, and we can get to how can we help you? We want to help you position instead of we can't do that or that doesn't work here. And so it's a really important part of our work is getting our staff and volunteers to be well trained and to not get trained once, but to get refreshed on that training. We do trainings every year on accessibility and inclusion. And then also, if you're hoping to operate accessible trails, even if you don't have staff at the sites, if it's a sanctuary or wildlife refuge or land trust trail that is not a staffed site, you still have to make sure your communications are really appropriate. So what's on your website? What are you saying about the trail? What kind of language you're using for people who might have disabilities? The trail materials that you're making available online or in print. You want to make sure they're as user-friendly as possible. You might be getting people using these trails who have a wide range of vision abilities, and so you want to make sure things are as user-friendly as possible. There are all sorts of guidelines on how to make a web page and a printed material user-friendly for people with a wide range of vision, for example. And then even if you're operating at a site that doesn't have staff, if your headquarters or your of your office, if people are answering the phone and answering questions about the trails, you want to make sure that they are giving really clear information. For example, this is something that comes up in our training. Someone calls and says, I plan to visit that All Persons Trail at that site next weekend. I'm going to be bringing a companion who uses a wheelchair. So I'm calling to find out, what it is I need to know. I want the person who answers the phone to give the information that's appropriate. For example, the trail's a half-mile long. The parking is right there. It's accessible. There's an access route. The trailhead's right there. It's surfaced in this kind of material. These are the, it meets ADA compliance for width and slope and elevation changes. There's nothing protruding on the trail that could catch up someone using a wheelchair or using a sight cane. The actual physical information for the trail, not anyone's opinion. Oh, I wouldn't do that on a wheelchair, because I can't imagine doing that. Or, oh, sure, all our trails really could be accessible if you really want to go there. No, I don't. I want the people answering the phone not to give out any opinions. I don't want their personal assessment or their stories. I want to know they're saying exactly what the person needs to know, which is what to expect physically and what accessibility options are there for them or what resources. So that's a big part of the training. We've had to train a lot of volunteers and visitor services staff to give out less information and to not chat about their feelings about the trail, because it's very it can get very subjective, and I want to make sure that we don't go there. Okay, next slide. So once you have a trail set up, if you already have one or if you're developing one, and you think you've got your materials, communications, and customer service folks ready, now we think about how we're welcoming people to the property. So we have updated our roadway and entrance signs to be a little more inclusive lately, and so we now have the sign on the left is our new design of, more or less, our new design of our roadway signs, where we say the name of the sanctuary and where people are going, but also we've put in this new banner that says all are welcome. And our community engagement consultants have educated me to know that if we have English and Spanish on our roadway and entrance signage, we are now reaching 90% of the people in Massachusetts. So the vast majority of people in Massachusetts speak English and Spanish. And if we really want to be welcoming and inclusive, not just for people with physical needs, but from people with all kinds of cultural backgrounds and relationships with nature, we need to be more welcoming and less limited. And so we now say all are welcome in English and Spanish. And I think that's a really important thing I've learned about inclusion, as well as the physical accessibility. And then the signs on the right are examples of what we have in the parking lot, which again repeats that, a little bit of Spanish, just, the name of the sanctuary is just a proper noun, so you don't need to translate that. But, what we want people to do. Check in at the Nature Center, the Discovery Center, whatever we call it, at different sites. It has different names. And then we add the icons, because not everybody responds well to written words, but we want to let people know who are going to respond better to icons, or maybe they don't speak English or Spanish, but they'll understand the icons. So we show that there are accessible wildlife viewing areas, picnic area, there's scenic vistas, there's trails. We do ask them not to bring dogs to most of our properties. And so we find the icons have helped reach yet another audience, people who respond better to icons than to written. So next slide. Yes, okay, thank you. Along the trails, we continue signage, although in place we right now just have English, but we are going to be translating our materials so that people can access copies maybe online or using their phones of the same information eventually in Spanish, and we might end up doing a third language if needed. But right now in English, along the trails, all of the trails have a entrance sign, and the entrance sign welcomes people to the trail. It tells them about the trail physically, it invites them to use all their senses, tells them what to expect. It thanks the funders and donors who've helped make the trail. And all of that information that's on the entrance sign is also available in other formats for people who can't read the entrance sign. And then along the way, you can just see a sample here of the trail signage we have. We try to put everything from once people get through the entrance sign, we try to have everything labeled in large block prints and in Braille along the signage, along the path. So, and everything's within reach of, you can see that the bottom center image has a rope guide, and I will get into that in a moment on the next slide, but everything we put is within reach of the trail or the rope guide, so that it's not, people don't have to work hard to reach it. And in addition, we are now incorporating more of these icons, so you'll see on the bottom that when we do identify a location, a sanctuary, a trail feature, an amenity that visitors might enjoy, we now label them with these small markers that have an image as well as what the name of the area is. So someone looking for a picnic table, for example, would know that symbol means a picnic area, even if they can't read picnic area. Okay, next slide. The trails have a large amount of our trails have a large amount of physical support. And this includes navigation, such as the rope guides. About half our trails have these post and rope systems. And those really help someone who is completely blind navigate the trail independently if the rope system isn't interrupted too many times. We have testers who are blind who help us determine how user-friendly these rope guides are. But we have them, I think it's the ideal to have the rope guide, but we only have them at about half our trails because it's not always practical. Some of the sites that don't have rope guides, we use railings and curbing as navigational cues. So you can see in the upper right that on that boardwalk trail through a wetland, people are guided. If they want a guiding system, we encourage them to use the railing on the right. And if they're using a sight cane or if they're using a mobility device, the bumper on the left side keeps them hopefully a little safer from falling in the water. I do want to tell you that my partner in developing these 12 trails and these tours is completely blind and has been completely blind since birth. And he now helps me deal with the navigation language. And he has said many times he would do the trail on the left with the rope guide independently. He would get dropped off at that trailhead, and 45 minutes or an hour later, he would get picked up at the end of the trail, then back at the beginning at the nature center. But the one with the boardwalk, he would not do that one alone. He just doesn't feel the setup is safe enough and he's comfortable enough. He would do it with a companion, with a sighted companion. So he calls that one accessibility friendly, whereas he calls the one on the left truly 100% accessible. And I just want to explain that because it is a progression, and you don't go from 0 to perfect. You know, some trails are just user friendly or accessibility friendly. Some are trails you really somebody could feel comfortable navigating alone. Not everybody. There's a lot of individuality and subjectivity in here. But I think you also have to realize that we know the difference too. Which of our trails are navigable independently or set up to be, and which are maybe a little less independently navigable. We also put seating along the trails wherever we can. So the image on the right shows us a bench. We try to have all sorts of seating: stones, benches with backings, benches with armrests. People have different needs, and my understanding is that any seating is appreciated. Some people benefit from seating with a backrest. Some people need an armrest to get in and out of a seating area, but any kind of seating is helpful. But we make sure that the seating is actually a multi-use seating area. So we don't just put a bench in. So you can't really see it that well in this image, but next to the bench is another 6 feet of cleared path, so that someone using a walker, a baby stroller, a wheelchair can use the seating area without being in the thorns or in the poison ivy or falling down the slope or in the mud, because it's surfaced just like the trail. And so that makes for a multi-use seating area. Everybody can use it, and it's open for everyone. And I just want to show you 2 more things on this slide, and that's the picnic table, which is this is an ADA style picnic table. We buy these in kits, the hardware. We buy the hardware in kits, and then our property managers get the wood or plasticized wood boards and assemble these. And they're designed so that someone using a mobility device, a walker or a wheelchair, can go up to the edges and use the table just like everyone else, without any barriers, without any pieces of the table in their way. And as well, the people using the benches, there's much less to climb over. You can just slide right onto the bench without having to trip over anything or lift your legs over to get in. And so they're just much easier to use. And they're called ADA style picnic tables. I get them from a park supply company, just the kits, a couple $100 for each kit. And then our property managers put them together. All of our sites have at least 2 of these tables somewhere along the path of the all persons trails, which generally go by the picnic areas. We make sure the picnic areas are part of the trail loop wherever we can. And lastly, on this slide, I just want to show you the bead system that we use on the trails that do have rope guides. We place beads along the way and explain at the beginning of the trail what the bead system means. We have found people have really responded well. The visually impaired community has really responded well and helped us figure this out. So if you're following along the rope guide, The round bead means that within arm's reach, there's an interpretive stop and a sign. And the square bead means there's seating nearby. And the instruction, if you're listening to the tour or reading the tour booklet, then you'll get instructions on how to find the nearby seating. There might be some navigation instructions. But that's just a set of the physical supports. We don't have all of these on every trail, but this is the ideal suite of physical supports that we strive for when we can. Next slide. Okay, we also want the trails to have lots of interpretive educational opportunities. And so we place multisensory tactile displays and learning opportunities along the way. So these might be displays like the life cycle of a butterfly. We have that at a butterfly garden. We have lots of opportunities to engage with trees, as you can imagine, and geologic features along the trail. If there's a great glacial boulder or pudding stone or a couple of trees with really different types of bark, we put that on the tour for people to experience tactily. Most of our nature, I think actually now all of our nature centers have solar arrays, and some of them are actually within reach. And in some towns, we are permitted to let people touch the arrays. Other towns, we're not. They have to be fenced off. And so where we can engage people with the solar features, we do. And then some of the sites actually have raised garden beds or other types of experiences available for people right along the trail. And so these are just more examples of displays and trail features that we try to plant along the way. Each of the trails has a tour that lasts about an hour, and we try to have about 10 or 12 of these features along the way, and 3 or 4 opportunities for seating and resting along the way. So if someone takes the whole tour, it could take average of an hour, but somebody who doesn't use the tour materials, who just wants to use the trail, can just enjoy it at their own pace. And you can go to the next slide. The trail materials that are developed for each of the trails include trail tour booklets, and we print these in a few different formats. So there are these regular print booklets that people can pick up at the Nature Center, or they can download them ahead of time and print them or use them on their own device. We also make them in large print for people who need them in large print, and we also make them in Braille. Now, I'm very aware that I've been informed that only 15% of people who are blind read Braille, and it's mostly people who have been blind from birth or very young age because they went through a schooling experience and they were taught how to read Braille as sort of from childhood through high school. But many people who are blind lost their eyesight later in life, and they never learned to read Braille, and there are so many other resources available to them, they don't necessarily need to read much Braille. However, one of our consultants, we have an accessibility team of fantastic consultants who help us with this work, and it includes the director of the Perkins Library, Kim, and she has agreed to make these Braille booklets for us because she really wants them available for the small number of people who will need them. She helps us in so many ways. She also makes the tactile maps, which I'll talk about in a moment, in the library. And so I feel that we know we don't get a lot of demand for the Braille booklets, but we want them available. We want them available for the people who need them. I just want to mention that online, we do have the trail booklet online in a Word doc, because that allows users to print it in their own preferred font style, font size, and color contrast combination. So if our materials aren't what works for them visually, they can make their own version. And we have found that's really important too. The tactile maps, all of the properties have a flat two-dimensional map on the entrance sign as well as in the booklet. But we've also found with the help of the Perkins Library that for some users, a tactile map makes a big difference. So they're very simple. They're printed on cardboard or cardstock. You'd have to go to one of our trails to see them. We can't really, they don't have any color. So if I held it up, it would look like a white piece of paper. So that won't really help much. But anyway, they're available for our visitors, for the visitors who want them. And then finally, all the tours are also replicated and available in an audio format. And these have been pretty popular. So the audio files are all available online. Any of you could go on our website and listen to any of the tours. Visitors can listen to the tours ahead of time. if that helps them get more comfortable and more prepared for their visit. They can also download the tour on their own audio player, which many people do. Some of the tours are available by cell phone. If the signal is good, the reception is good, sometimes we're able to set up a cell phone tour. And we also have available audio players for loan, and there's a picture of one down on the left. It's called a Victor Stream Reader. A lot of people who need to read audiobooks or prefer to read audiobooks use this. And so every time we loan it to someone who is visually impaired, they seem to know how to use it. And if not, we can show them quickly. So, and we can go to the next slide. Just want to show you some of the scenes we have. We have a lot of people using the trails. We invite their feedback because it's so important. It's not like this work is ever done. We get better and better at it every year, largely with the feedback of people using the trails, both the visitors, program participants, and then also our staff, things that have gone smoothly, things that haven't, what maintenance needs we have. And so it's an ongoing process, and I just want to emphasize that. And I think with my last slide, next slide. Yeah. Just want to tell you that this is absolutely a progression. I don't think we'll ever be done learning. I don't think we'll ever be done networking. So we keep learning. We're operating 12 of these trails. We collect visitor feedback. I'm currently working on 3 new trails. And when I say me, I mean my colleagues and I. There's a lot of people working on this. We do a lot of networking with other groups trying to be more accessible, other cultural groups, other land-based groups. I've been in a network for 6 years with historic museums, botanic museums, zoos, gardens, nature centers that have outdoor spaces that we're trying to make more accessible. A lot of information with each other, and we do a lot of presentations like this to try to help the whole collective of people who want to make trails more accessible, learn what's involved. And as I told you with the English-Spanish, and using icons, I'm constantly expanding my own understanding and perception of inclusivity, what it means to welcome someone who might need physical support, but also someone who doesn't have much experience enjoying nature, isn't comfortable using a trail. These trails are very user-friendly for people just heading out for the first time or bringing young children, and the trails are so well marked and they're so easy to navigate physically, they tend to be more user-friendly for people who are newer to using outdoor trails. And I just want to close with the notation that accessibility includes a lot. You can take a cart path or a service road that's already on one of the properties that you steward, and you can add a few features, add some seating, make sure the parking is accessible, and you can call it an accessible trail because it could meet ADA compliance very easily, and that's a great start. But if you want to get further into the layers, you just need to be aware. I'd like to help you be more aware that accessibility inclusion really includes this whole universal design thinking, the seating, the materials, the customer service, what you place along the trail for educational opportunities if you so choose. People who have physical disabilities often, and also people who might be coming from more urbanized areas, might have transportation limitations, and many of the trails are not on public transit lines. And so just being realistic about the transportation, and helping people see which trails are accessible by public transit, which ones might be accessible by paratransit, which is actually most of them, and how to help people make those connections. As I said, the customer service is a huge part of this in terms of the information you're giving out and how you're greeting visitors if you're in a position to greet them. The materials should be available in multiple formats, ideally, and available in advance, ideally. People who need accommodations often want or need that information before they come to feel secure and comfortable in coming to the trail. Again, that level of independence and just being honest about how the trail is set up physically so someone can decide if they're comfortable navigating and visiting on their own or not. And the importance of outreach. We have a lot of accessibility consultants that I work with. I have partners on the projects. I don't do any of this without their involvement. The disability community, just like every other community, would say, please, nothing about us without us. We really want to make sure they're engaged, they're helping us do this better, and we're listening and we're learning together. And they also help with a lot of the outreach, which helps a lot of people know about the trails and use them. So having those partners has been incredible. Every one of these trails is finalized with about 7 testers who bring a whole bunch of different accommodation requirements. I wouldn't dream of calling one of these trails developed or finished without the testing group, without that input. And we're always improving them. So I think with that, that's my whole story. And I know there will be some questions, which I believe we're going to get to at the end. But my time is up, and I think I'm going to hand it over to Ray.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lucy. I want to take a moment just to thank Mass Audubon and EEA and DCR. And I know there are other land trusts. I know that the Greenbelt has worked on accessibility trails, and want to thank all of the land trusts that are helping to make this happen. I'm not aware of what's happening in Rhode Island, so for any of you who are participating here who know who the experts are in making things happen in Rhode Island, if you could add a link or some information to the Q&A, I think all of us would find that very helpful. If I could have my first slide. The one before that?
There we go. Can you see that?
Yes. Next slide, please. So one of the concepts I want to convey to all of you is that the Americans with Disabilities Act, we hear what you got to do and what you don't have to do, but at a very basic level, it's an anti-discrimination law, very similar to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the idea is that people with disabilities and a whole range of different kinds of disabilities have the same opportunities that people who do not have disabilities have. So, just like we wouldn't keep people off of our properties based on their national origin or their religion, we're not going to do anything that would keep people off of our properties due to their disability. And then perhaps just as importantly, we wouldn't ask someone about their national origin or religion. We're going to be very careful what we ask them about their disability, because they're entitled to their privacy, and their physical condition is not our business. Our business is to make properties as accessible as possible to everyone, including people with disabilities. Next slide, please. So the ADA definition of a disability, the first one I think is the most important one. It's, I want to say, any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. It doesn't have to be a permanent impairment. It can be a temporary one. It can be someone who's perhaps they had COVID last week, and for a short while they're tired or they're unable to move as readily as they possibly. These rules still apply to people with temporary disabilities. In fact, the next one plays to that. We can't discriminate against people who have a record of such impairment. So some of these are more applicable to employment situations than ours, but someone who has a history of heart trouble or cancer or whatever, maybe they don't have it now, but you can't hold that against them. You can't limit their ability to enjoy one of our properties. Next slide, please. So the Americans with Disabilities Act has 3 major titles. And the first one applies to employment places in federal government. The second one applies to other government entities. So if anyone here is on their local conservation commission or board of selectmen, and you have properties that are open to the public, this applies to you. We're going to be focusing on Title 3 today, which is properties that are privately owned. And that includes land owned by land trusts. Any place that's a park or a place of recreation that's open to the public and contains a human-made improvement. So for example, any of your properties that have a trail on it have a human-made improvement on it. And this includes properties that your land trust doesn't own, but perhaps holds a conservation restriction or easement on, and where the public is allowed to use the trails that are on that property. You can't tell someone in a wheelchair or who has a disability that they can't go on that property because of their disability. So this is a key thing. We're land trusts, we're privately owned, our properties are open to the public for recreation, and in most cases, they include human-made improvements, so they apply to us. Next slide, please. So there's a whole bunch of standards that have been developed for complying with the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're not going to go into them at all today. These are just examples of standards that have been created. I wanted a slide that showed that these are the kinds of things you can go looking for. Part of what I want to advise you, and we can see here that Lucy and Mass Audubon apply to this, is that you need an expert. You can't just think that you can figure it out on your own. Reach out to other people who know the rules or know how different disabilities are affected in their ability to go on a property, and ask questions and listen to what is said. Next slide. If you really want to get into the weeds, there is an outdoor development areas accessibility guideline. It's available online. The link is below. It's over 100 pages. There's lots and lots and lots of detail in there. So for example, when Lucy was talking about the accessible picnic tables that Mass Audubon gets that cost them $200, if you were to go in this guide and look at what's required to have an accessible picnic table, every imaginable dimension is included. Height from the ground, width of the benches, height of the benches. It's an amazing number of details. I'll tell you, for $200, you can reach out to someone who's already figured it out and manufactured it and just say, send me one of those. That's what you want to do. Rely on people who have already figured these kinds of things out. But if you really want to get into the weeds, this is one of the books to read. Next slide. So you can't always make a property fully ADA accessible, and the law understands that. So there are exceptions. If it's not practical due to terrain, you can't make the front face of El Capitan fully ADA compliant. It just wouldn't happen. For a whole number of reasons, part of which might be there's no prevailing construction practices to get it done, but even more importantly, the next line down, it would fundamentally alter the function or purpose of the facility or setting. You can't ruin the resource. You shouldn't ruin the resource in order to make it ADA compliant. The next one down is maybe there are cultural, historic, or significant natural features that are eligible for protection under law. I remember a year or two ago when we were able to meet in person, there was a session on a site, I think it was in Northfield, Massachusetts, where they wanted to build an accessible trail on an ancient battlefield between Native Americans and the English. And well, historically, they thought the battle had played out one way. The placard outside said that the Native Americans had slaughtered the English. It turns out that some studies showed it was the other way around. Well, when they started to put in the trail and they found the arrowheads and the bullets and so on and so forth, suddenly they had to really think about, well, where is this trail going to go? How is it going to go? Because you don't want to destroy the feature that makes the place important. I also want you to note that this list does not include an exemption for cost. Can't just say, well, it's not in our budget this year, or we'll never be able to afford it. You need to think about practical ways to make some of these things happen. Next slide. Very important concepts here. Wheelchairs. Wheelchairs and other devices that are designed to help a person with a disability function. So it's not just wheelchairs, it's canes, it's hand carriers, it's a whole range of things that are designed specifically to help people with disabilities to function in our world. You can never say no to those things. You see a wheelchair, motorized or not, you cannot tell that person they cannot use a wheelchair on your property. Now, Lucy was talking about giving lots and lots of information, objective information, People need that. The person in the wheelchair generally knows what that machine is capable of doing and where it can go. So they want to know, how long is this trail? How steep is this trail? What's the material that it's on? These are all very objective pieces of information that that person needs to make a decision, their own decision, about whether to bring the wheelchair or their walker or their cane or what have you onto the property. But you can never say no to a wheelchair or another device that has been designed for people with disabilities. Now, then there's this thing called OPDMDs, other power-driven mobility devices. This is any kind of device that's built for anybody to use that a person with a disability might find useful to go places. And you can't say no to an OPDMD unless you've made reasonable accommodations to your policies, practices, and procedures to permit them for people who have disabilities, unless they can't be operated in accordance with legitimate safety requirements. And I would add also environmental requirements. So this is a very broad range of vehicles. Would you go to the next slide? These are all OPDMDs. The ATV, the snowmobile, the bicycle, the scooter, the Segway in the bottom middle, and even the four-wheel drive vehicle. A person with a disability thinks that that device can help them enjoy a property or enter a property. You can't say no unless you've done your homework beforehand. So let's go to the next slide.
Ray, just so you're aware, I'm noticing a bit of a delay
Okay.
in the slides.
It's probably good for people to stare at this slide for a minute. So in the materials that are being released with this workshop, the Nature Conservancy has a fairly exhaustive analysis that I would recommend you perform for every one of your properties to decide to what extent you need to regulate or even prohibit OPDMDs. And they relate to the type, size, and speed of the device. For example, it's going to be probably much easier to regulate or prohibit the use of that four-wheel drive device than the Segway. You can also think about how much pedestrian traffic there is. The more people there are, the more concerns that there's going to be that someone's going to get injured because someone's using a powered device. And then you get into the regular things about designing and operational characteristics and how safe it can be to use these devices in a property, and whether they will cause serious harm to natural or cultural resources. So for example, the four-wheel drive, really easy example, we're just about entering mud season. It should be very easy to just say vehicles over a certain weight, certain horsepower can't be used on a property between March and June. You can have regulations like that. Other regulations you can have are to limit speed. You can say that people can't use these devices at faster than walking speed, because that's the speed that pedestrians are at, and you don't want people zipping around. Next slide. So once you've done the suggested or recommended assessment of each of your properties, then you can come in with these rules. And then very much want to recommend that on your website or at a sign at the entrance, that you post any limitations on the use of OPDMDs on each one of your properties. It's very important for people with disabilities to be able to figure out in advance where they can go and how they can go there. And Lucy mentioned that people call here and they say they're planning on going to this property next week. How does it work with the wheelchair? How does it work with the walker? How does it work with, well, it could be how does it work with the OPDMD? And the more information that people have before they leave their home, the better. And then it's good to have a sign there as well to make sure there's no question at the trailhead that they have the information they need to figure out whether they can use the OPDMD or whether other device they have on the property safely and in accordance with your regulations. Next slide. So as Lucy mentioned, you got to be careful about what you ask people about their disabilities. They're entitled to their privacy. Their health is not really your business. It's noted that for an OPDMD, if someone shows up in that four-wheel drive or the dirt bike or what have you, you can ask whether they need the device. And if the person replies, I need it because I have a disability, and it complies with your regulations for OPDMDs, you have to let them use it. Other evidence would be if they have a disability card on their vehicle or on their person, or just a statement by them that I need this device. It's always a little dangerous to inquire into a person's disability. Rachel Hampton from the Nature Conservancy told me that roughly 80% of the people who have a disability, it is not readily observable. People have had heart conditions, limited lung capacity. There's a whole range of disabilities that are not readily observable, and you shouldn't put yourself in the role of a doctor thinking that you can figure out whether this person is credible with their disability or not. Now, if they get on the property with that OPDMD and they start tearing the place up, that's grounds to say that they have to leave because they're harming the resource. But you got to be careful about what you ask and what you do when they're first initially going on. Next slide. Service animals. There's only two types of service animals. You're almost always going to see a dog, but actually miniature horses are also trained to be service animals. One of the big advantages of the miniature horses is that they tend to have a service life of 20 years. A dog, I think, is in the 6 to 8 year range. So for one training, you get a lot longer period with the animal. I have personally not seen a miniature horse used as a service animal. I think we've all seen dogs used as service animals. So what is a service animal? It is an animal that has been trained to work and perform tasks for an individual with a disability. And it can do tasks performed directly to that disability, and is always harnessed or leased or under the person's control. So a dog that is not under control is not a service animal. Next slide. So free-ranging service dogs. No, the animal is there for the person. The animal is not there so that they can commune with nature or other animals. There are times when you probably can limit even the use of service dogs if it would fundamentally alter the nature of the service or program provided. And the only example I can think of would be if you have a true wilderness area or a very high value sensitive habitat area where the presence of a dog might disturb nesting birds or other animals, then maybe you could say no to a service animal in that location. But anytime you see an animal that is out of control, anytime you see an animal that is leaving behind stuff that shouldn't be left behind, or that is posing a direct threat to the health or safety of others, like dogs that jump on other people, dogs that jump on other dogs, dogs that bark at other animals, a barking dog generally is not a service animal. If it's barking to alert its person that there's something that that person needs to be aware of, then the dog is doing its job. But if it's barking because it's excited or anxious, that is not a service dog. Next page, please. Very similar to an OPDMD, you can ask, is it required because of a disability? And you can ask what the dog has been trained to do. An important note here, we've had this problem with so-called comfort animals, and people are getting other animals, a whole range of things, and they're getting onto airplanes, they're getting onto our conservation properties, and they're saying, well, my therapist says I need this. That is not a service animal. And you do not need to allow them. That was someone, Janet Zeller once noted to me. Janet Zeller was the longtime expert on such matters for the U.S. Forest Service. If someone has a pocket dog and they're keeping it in their pocket, if it's not causing any harm, maybe you don't need to make an issue out of it. But if a dog is creating an issue, then it's not a service dog, and feel free to confront the owner and deal with it. Next slide. So your website is a very important place for people with disabilities. It's great to see all the work that Audubon and some of the other organizations have done to provide as much information as possible, so that people can figure out where they can go and what they can do before they leave their home. The Obama administration was proposing regulations to regulate how you would have to set up your website for this information. The Trump administration put that aside, so there are currently no regulations on this. We're told that the Biden administration is probably going to revisit this. But in the meantime, the problem with not having a regulation is that there's no way to know whether your website is compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So what has been suggested for now for Title III entities like land trusts is that there is the World Wide Web Consortium Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0. You're going to need an expert to help figure that out. I'm going to guess that Lucy and Mass Audubon have checked that out and have a consultant on that. For the rest of you who perhaps can't afford that, do the best you can. Try to provide as much usable information, objective information as you can, and for as many types of people with different kinds of disabilities as possible, including people who are hearing impaired, sight impaired, who cannot use a keyboard. Think about ways to make your website as accessible as possible and include as much information as possible. Next slide. What happens if you're not in full compliance with the ADA? So someone with a disability can bring a lawsuit against you. And just like many other discrimination lawsuits, the person filing the lawsuit is not going to get any money out of it. But you could be required to pay their attorney's fees, and they could get an injunctive order that requires you to perform certain work on your property to correct the situation, improve the situation. Attorney's fees, of course, can be very high. The law is basically designed to encourage attorneys to take on these cases to help people with disabilities. The government can get involved if they generally don't do it on a spot basis, but if they see a pattern of discrimination or if there's an issue of general public importance, then the Department of Justice does get involved. And they have all the same remedies as a private party, except they can also seek monetary damages. Of course, even if you're fully right, all litigation is painful and expensive. If you can find a way to accommodate people, it's always going to be less expensive and painful than going through litigation. Next slide. So just a reminder that the Land Trust Alliance's standards and practices exists, and especially for accredited land trusts, there are standards that I think you must comply with. But for all of us, they're good practices. I've included a handout for this that goes into the weeds on this, showing the ones that are specifically required of accredited land trusts, but that all of us should be engaging in for the benefit of our whole community. Next slide. Personal note. So as my bio noted, my father was a quadriplegic. I was 2 when he became a quadriplegic. He was 29. And part of the theme I want to have for you here is he was, of course, very much affected by this. He couldn't move anything below his neck. But it also meant my mother and I were also affected because we couldn't leave him at home. We couldn't leave him behind. So places that he couldn't go, we couldn't go either. So a very memorable day in my youth was we were in New Hampshire and we went up the Mount Washington Auto Road because he could go up it. And he had a stretcher in the back, and we had the family station wagon, and we had a special arrangement to have him in a stretcher in the back. And it was a day just like pictured in here. We could see, I want to say we could see to the North Pole. The view was fantastic. The sun was out, and he got to take it in too. But that was one of only 2 mountains that I went up to the top of while he was alive. The other one being Cadillac Mountain in Acadia National Park, because that also has an auto road to the top. So the reason for this picture is to remind you it's not just about the people with the disabilities. It's their family, it's their friends, it's everyone who's connected to that, because whatever that disability is, it's also tying to those other people. When you create accessible trails, accessible places, you're expanding our whole community. Next slide. So when I was talking to Scott, who's going to be up in just a couple minutes, and he reminded me that he spent some time in Florida, and that brought back another memory. So when I was 4, almost 5 years old, we went and spent the winter down in Miami. And while we were there, we went to Cypress Gardens. And I remember going to Cypress Gardens. I remember the motorboat with the fancy skiers on it. But I also remember the boardwalk, because my father could go down the boardwalk in his wheelchair. It's the only time I can recall in my life I got to go into the woods with my father. It was a very memorable day. And I want to implore all of you to do what you can to expand opportunities for people with disabilities, because there's lots of 4-year-olds out there who will also benefit from that opportunity. I really want to thank all of you for listening to our talk here today. And I want to go to the next slide. So this is Randy Pierce. I attended a talk that he gave a couple years ago, and Randy was well, just like anyone else, into college, and then he started losing his sight, and he became totally blind when he was 30. Well, since then, like me, he's climbed all the 4,000 footers in New Hampshire. But he's done more than me. He's done all of them in the winter time as well. He's climbed all of them at least twice. And he's totally blind. He's also climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. So for a lot of these things, if we can just get out of people's way and give them a reasonable amount of help, they can enjoy their life to its fullest. And I think that's just a great thing for all of us to do for each other. So thank you. For the next slide, I want to introduce Scott Morrill, who is Massachusetts Off-Highway Vehicle Coordinator. He spoke about a year or so ago at one of the Mass Land Trust Coalition Steering Committee meetings, and I really liked hearing what he had to say and wanted to just give him a few minutes to introduce himself and what he and his program offer. So Scott, turning it over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So just to tie in briefly with what Ray had to say, when he spoke about making their own decision about, where they wanted to be and what they felt they could access, there's a high-ranking official in one of the national off-highway vehicle organizations, and I had him speak at one of my advisory committee meetings, and he had mentioned that he wanted to experience the outdoors on his own conditions. The only time he felt free was when he was out on his ATV, experienced the woods like everybody else. And that reality never really hit him until he got back and loaded up his ATV back onto his pickup, and a 6-inch curb stopped him in his tracks. That hit me really hard. And I suppose I wasn't prepared for the amount of people that were looking to recreate with off-highway vehicles because they had mobility impairments. And that's, specifically what I'll be talking about here is mobility impairments. And just allowing people to experience the woods, the deep woods, on their own accord. And of course, not everybody recreates in that manner, but in speaking with those that do, it's really about freedom and really experiencing life and reconnecting with nature. And for me, nature has played a major part in my life about keeping a balance and happiness and health. And I suppose when I approach it, I wonder, what would happen? How would I feel if that ability was taken from me? And it is certainly spurred me on to creating more trails, more accessible trails. And I know a lot of people, when they think of off-highway vehicles, they don't make that connection. I understand that. But there is a connection. And I suppose, there's also, when we look at mobility impairments, we think of a traumatic life event or perhaps something that occurred at birth. But it also manifests in different ways that I think we also need to address. And part of that is, the health of the person. In America, we're very, in this culture where business oriented, everybody works, very little time off. We don't have a lot of time. Maybe our diet isn't what it should be. We don't get the exercise we should have. And, we put on weight. We're not in shape. And that leads to mobility impairments as well. And it also could be age. There's a large portion of our population now who is getting up there in their age. And the only way that they can get out into the woods is through some of these vehicles. And that generation never had computers or cell phones or whatnot. Their recreation was the woods, and it was out being active, and they still want to be active. So that's something that we're addressing right now in state government is, there's a new type of, well, not new anymore, but these side-by-side machines that a lot of this aging population is really gravitating towards. It's very user-friendly. It's a lot more comfortable and safe. So we're trying to develop more trails for them. So I'm going to keep it brief and open it up to any questions if anyone has it. But those, Lucy and Ray, what great presentations you had. Thank you for doing your work. It's incredibly inspiring. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I want to ask you, when should people be calling you? When should people be looking to your program?
So my program has been primarily working in developing clubs to develop a network of user groups that can sustain these types of trails and provide guidance and grant writing and other technical support when developing trails. I'm certainly available to assist in any sort of trail development or any questions for developing these OHV trails. I know that they are a little bit different than some of your other trail designs. There are things to take into account about grade and friction and spin of tires and the soil composition. But I'm willing to assist in any way I can in developing any trails. And I know that this type of activity certainly isn't conducive to a lot of properties and what people are managing. But I think that perhaps, and what we're finding in some of our state properties, that there are properties that can sustain this type of use that really just hasn't been explored yet.
Thank you. I think we're into Q&A.
Yeah. So it looks like we've got a number of questions. Do you want me to read them off to you, or can you see them?
Yes. Why don't you read them?
I'd like you to read them, Nick, if you don't mind.
Okay. Question from Lucy from Lauren Miller Donnelly. Given some of the funding for accessible trails at Mass Audubon was provided via the Institute of Museum and Library Services, what advice can you give to land trusts and nonprofits for applying for this type of grant without a library or a nature center?
Sure. Hi, Lauren. Nice to see you. Yes, we've had each of the trails has been funded by a strange, a unique combination of funding. And so, yes, we did apply, and we were able to do the overlay, that experiential piece, on 8 of our trails with a very generous federal grant from the Institute for Museum and Library Services, which worked to make cultural and library and museum experiences more accessible. And we were able to go in under the museum heading, meaning that our nature centers were also like living museums. But in addition, there are federal trail grants that are disseminated through Mass Trails. So there's this Massachusetts Recreational Trails grant every year. DCR manages the applications and the awards, and we've received several of those. And so I would encourage you to work in the Rec Trails grant arena. And then we've had, as you know, mitigation funds for have been awarded that we've used toward accessible trails. have also, some families who have a family member who wants to use such trails have been on some of our trails and have helped give us money to make more trails available. So it's just a very, very creative combination of funding. But I would suggest, if you're in whatever state you're in, I think you're in Rhode Island, I would suggest you see who's managing the Rhode Island federal, the Rhode Island distribution of those federal recreational trail funds, because multi-use trails include accessible trails in that grant program. And I don't know if Ray or Scott have additional ideas.
I think that's a great idea. The RTP program is fantastic. I know the state relies on it, and a lot of other agencies. I sit on the panel as an EEA liaison, so the people that are involved in it are fantastic. Amanda Lewis in Massachusetts is in charge of it from DCR. Incredibly helpful, very approachable, and a great source to develop trails. We have such a great network here in Massachusetts, and I see a lot of applications come through, and they're amazing. So I certainly endorse that.
So since Lauren is in Rhode Island, I would suggest the Department of Environmental Management, or find out from them who you should go to.
Okay. Anna Wilkins asks, is the training for staff and volunteers on ADA accessibility and inclusion standard and available, or is it something that you created?
We created our own version of it because we wanted it to be based in a nature center setting. But the New England ADA Center has trainings available that are more general, and I would encourage you to contact them. They're based in Boston somewhere, but it's the New England ADA Center. The country has different regions for ADA headquarters and resource centers, and so the one for New England is based in Boston. They have trainings, they do trainings, and we developed our own training. And I received support last year to put some of our trainings online, and I'm happy to share some of those materials with anyone who would like to view them and use them. Just contact me. I will figure out how to make that work. We also, I should also say, we do the trainings every year or two, and we've often had other organizations. I invite other organizations to send someone to our trainings. Some internal trainings.
Is there an
so
expense
again, we'll figure out how to. What was that?
Is there an expense to other organizations sending people to your training sessions?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed the beginning, Ray. You're breaking up a bit.
We're breaking up. Does it cost money to go to your training sessions?
No.
Thank you, Mass Audubon.
No, we've had colleagues who work in botanic gardens, state parks, and zoos come as my guests because I do so much networking. We go to each other's trainings. We just, as a courtesy, we just invite each other. I'm happy to include anyone who would find that really interesting. Our next training is March 31st. Anyway, we'll make sure we put my contact info in the chat if anyone's interested.
Thank you.
And Nia asks, when restricting dogs to sites, this is another question for Lucy, does this include service dogs? And if service dogs are allowed on all persons trails, how do you address those who need service dogs?
Yeah. So people who use service animals have legal access to everywhere the public has access. We can't tell them they can't bring a dog. However, we got guidance from some of the leaders in Massachusetts, sort of in the service dog community. We got some guidance on how to create a statement that lets people know what some of our concerns and special situations are. So, for example, we have a couple sites with farm animals. We have a few sites with wildlife species on exhibit. And so we do have a statement, and if someone contacts us and says they're bringing a service animal and coming to visit, we ask them to be familiar with the statement. And it says all the things that Ray said. You know, the animal has to be under the control of the handler at all times. And if the service dog, it's usually a dog, is at an area with outdoor animal exhibits, and the interaction between the service animal and the animal on exhibit is not going well, we ask them to leave the exhibit area. At our farm, when a visitor comes with a service animal, the admissions desk radios everybody on the farm who was working that day and says, we have a guest with a service animal coming down. That way, 10 more people don't approach that person and say, is this a service animal? What's it trained to do? You know, we really want to be courteous and supportive, and we don't want to hassle the person. They have a legal right to be there. We're trying to make it work. We want the service dog to be safe. We want the handler to be safe, and we want the wildlife and the farm animals and the other visitors to be safe. That is the goal. But we never want to or should say no. We're not legally going to say no. We're going to try to make it work. So on our website, if you were to go to massaudubon.org/accessibility, you would see our information about our trails, which includes a video, which we weren't able to load today. It includes a guidelines manual we wrote that has a lot of the information that's been shared. And it also includes our service animal statement, as well as our OPDMD policies and a day use permit. So I would suggest you go on the website, which might answer or give you more information about this service animal statement. And I do want to add that that's been a big, important part of the training. So many of our sanctuary visitor services personnel, and whether they're staff, volunteers, have had to protect our sites from visiting dogs for so long. I've had to untrain them and retrain them on how to deal with service dogs, because it's a different thing.
Okay, so it looks like we've got 3 minutes left, and we still have 7 questions. So maybe the presenters could answer a couple questions after the presentation. Just type them in. But how about I get a couple questions for Ray, since we only have a few minutes left. So Mariah asks, can you speak to the difference between ADA guidelines and the Forest Service trail accessibility guidelines?
So they're very similar. They're law when applied to federal properties. They are considered best management practices when applied to land trust properties and to other government-owned properties. So I hope.
Okay, great. So John Hess asks, if a trail is open to the public, is it required to be accessible for all?
No. So the answer should be yes. But the practicalities are, there's a lot of properties out there, and there's a lot of trails out there, and there's no way you can become instantly compliant. You heard the process that Lucy goes through to create an accessible trail. It takes time. I think the guidance I want to give all the land trusts is start the journey. Pick a property, pick a trail, pick a second one. Get going, get people knowing that you're doing these things, and build your community, because once they know it's there, they will start talking, and other resources and opportunities will come available to you. But you got to take that first step. Ideally, over time, people should be able to go to all your properties. But the other reason I put up the picture of the Mount Washington Auto Road is because there are 48 mountains in New Hampshire that are above 4,000 feet, and Washington's the tallest one. But only one of those 48 mountains has a road to the top of it. That one road makes a huge difference. It would ruin the atmosphere or the resource if you had a road to the top of every mountain. So think about balancing the resources and the opportunities to provide access. It could be that in some places, one really good trail it will make a big difference in your community's approach to your properties and your organization.